Hey everyone, and welcome to Study with Caesar. So today's episode, we're going to be covering functions on graph, and we're going to be going through the straight line graph. So make sure you are subscribed and make sure you follow us on Instagram and TikTok. Let's get into it. So we're going to be covering the straight line. It's so important to understand the basics of functions and graphs. So this is very important for you to understand whether in grade 10, 11 or 12, because understanding the basics will help you answer the questions. So follow through, and if you have any questions, do pop them in the comments. So the straight line graph, basically we start with the equation where y equals to mx plus c is our standard form, and this standard form answers a lot of questions actually, right? So y is the subject of the formula and represents the variable value on the graph. So on the y-axis, the gradient is m, and there's a lot to say about m. So m is basically the slope of the graph. So if you look at this graph over here, if you have two coordinates, m is basically the slope of the graph. X is the variable value of x on the graph, so what's on the x-axis, and c, this is the point that the line will cross the y-axis. So this is the y-axis, where the y-axis is crossed is actually a coordinate 0 and a c value. So whatever that y value is there is actually c. Now let's go into detail with certain parts of the straight line, and that is the slope or the gradient, which is very important. So the slope is m, basically calculated as y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So if you are basically given two coordinates, this is what you will use. If you're given, for instance, 4 and 6 and 3 and 2, you'll substitute this. So 4 and 6 will be your x1 and x2, and then and y1, and then 3 and 2 will be your x2 and y2, which you'll substitute into this formula to get your gradient. Now, different factors to consider also when you're having a gradient is that when m is negative, this is how your slope is going to be like, sliding from downwards from left to right. If m is negative. So if m is positive, from left to right on the x-axis, it's going to be going upwards. So if it's going upwards from left to right, we're seeing that m is positive. Our gradient will be positive. If m is parallel to the y-axis, m is undefined. And if m is equal to 0, that will mean m is parallel to the x-axis. Then what we know about parallel lines, we know that parallel lines have the same gradient. So this gradient of this straight line will be equal to the same gradient of this straight line. And then for perpendicular lines, perpendicular meaning that where they touch, there's a 90-degree angle that we see. We know that the following is true: m1 times m2 is equals to -1. So find out you have the gradient of one variable, and then you'll have to maybe solve for the gradient of the other variable once you see that they are perpendicular. Now moving on, things that you need to know is you firstly need to know how to draw a straight line. So you could use different methods in drawing a straight line. So the first method would be a dual intercept method. Basically find the y-intercept. So this is where x is equals to 0. And then also find the x-intercept. This is where you say y is equals to 0. So for instance, if they've given you the equation of a graph and they want you to solve it, just find the y-intercept, the x-intercept, and then you'll be able to draw the straight line. Another method is to use the gradient intercept method. Basically, you will need to convert the equation into a standard form of y equals mx plus c, and then read off the gradient and the y-intercept. Then the next thing you will also need to know how to do is how to determine the equation of a straight line, right? You will need to know how to determine the equation. You will need to basically be able to find your m and your c in the equation y equals to mx plus c, right? You'll need to know how to find m and c, and then basically write it as y equals to mx plus c at the end of the day. Now, we have an equation that we can use as well, which is y minus y1 equals to mx minus x1, right? And this can be rewritten into a standard form. But what we see with this equation is that if you're, for instance, given coordinates, you're given y1 and x1, and x and y is the another point on the line, you can substitute m to find y minus y1 over x minus x1 to find your gradient, and then you substitute the other point to find what c is and write it into the standard form. So for instance, over here we're given points -2 and 2 and -4, and then m and 4. So basically, using this equation, y minus y1 equals to m x minus x1. Luckily over here we are given the gradient, so we can substitute this x1 and y1. Y minus y1 is -4. Remember your bracket, and m, which is 5, x minus x1. x1 is just 2, right? So then you solve for it. So this becomes y plus 4 equals to 5x minus 10. If you times it in, take the 4 to the other side. So it's going to be minus 10 minus 4. So y equals to 5x minus 14. So at the end of the day, when you're asked to find the equation, make sure you write it in standard form. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you follow and share this to a friend, and comment if you understand, and comment if you have any questions.